Welcome artists, arters, and art appreciators to my channel. This is my Halloween special, and it's a very special one. It's the most complex doll that I've ever made, and she's based on this character that I created in 2015. She's just this cutesy ballerina, pumpkin-headed character, and I drew her this year, you can see on the right, and then on the left are some drawings from previous years. And this year is the most intensive of her because it's not just a drawing, but I'm going to be making her as a ball-jointed doll. Now, ball-jointed dolls are so complex, and I started one back in May, and I never finished her. And I decided to basically recycle these pieces that I have, which are basically just hollow torso pieces, a hollow head piece, tubes for arms and legs, some little test beans for the knee and elbow joints. You can see the diagram of the drawing on the left. She's a ball-jointed doll. She's got most of the balls that you can have. She's not quite double-jointed. She's kind of in the middle of double and single-jointed, I would say, in ball-jointed dolls, but I don't know. I'm not super familiar necessarily with ball-jointed dolls, and of course, this is the first one that I'm ever making, and I don't have any for reference, so I mostly just referenced pictures of other people's ball-jointed dolls that I saw online, which means I kind of made it up as I went along, so I'm not an expert, just testing things out, trying things out, and in this video I'll talk about things that I did, but also things that I should have done or could have done. Not should have done, but things I could have done, maybe it would make her better. And I wanted to start off by saying, if you look at a piece of art and you think, I could have done this, or I should have done this, that's not a bad thing, because that means that you learned something while making it. So I just wanted to say that I want to be very positive about this piece. I liked how she turned out, and I'm going to tell you about what I did and what I could have done differently. But just know the whole time that this is coming from a place of, like, reflection, and it's a good thing to reflect. It's a good thing. So I did have to redraw her feet, because the original doll design that I had just, like, flat feet for, she was just gonna be, like, flat and barefooted, but this doll is a ballerina, and she's end point, which is toe pointed completely down. Ballerinas have crazy strength in their toes, which is just so impressive, and I looked at a lot of pictures of them to try and get this as best as possible. They do turn out a little bit square. I decided to do an armature sort of thing inside the feet because I was worried about air dry clay alone breaking. And I was gonna the original plan was to make her out of polymer clay on her hands and feet, because I've seen people have issues with air dry clay breaking once the elastic is strung through the doll's body. Unfortunately, at this point, I have been working with air dry clay a lot more recently than polymer clay, so I don't end up using air dry clay for actually sculpting the fingers. I instead start with this armature and use a little bit of polymer clay to hold it together and air dry clay for the details, which you'll see later on. I did use Paperclips as the wire for most of for these hands and feet, and then jewelry wire for the fingers. And the Paperclips were just because I feel like Paperclips are fairly strong. They always seem sturdier than, like, the jewelry wire that I have. I guess I just need stiffer wires. And at this point, I also put on the little S hooks, which will hold the elastic when she's ready to be strung. So a lot of this was adding on pieces of clay, wet pieces of clay around the joints, and then carving them out once they were dry. And that does include the face a little bit, which started as a sort of hollow ball that I had made originally back in May, and I had to do a lot of adding on and fleshing out of this, even like off camera. I'm not the best at sculpting faces, necessarily. One of the harder things to sculpt, I would say, but I tried to reference other dolls online. I have a couple of dolls myself, like a Monster High doll, and I think Jessie from Toy Story also for some reason, and just looking at them and seeing how other people, sculpt their dolls. I don't tend towards making like super small noses or really small anything. I tend towards like both big eyes and big noses and big mouths and just everything. So she ends up looking a little bit oversized cartoony at first, and I later add on to her sort of forehead area to make her head a little bit wider. I will say one other thing is, why does she have this face at all? And I can't really exactly say why, but I liked the idea of her having a face underneath her pumpkin head. This character, my idea for her was like maybe she's like some sort of ghost spirit, and like she wears the pumpkin head over herself for whatever reason. It was also good practice to just practice sculpting a face. Here is me, a disaster human being, reminding you to always wash your hands before you work on your doll, lest you get chocolate on her. If you would like to donate to me, a disaster, you can go to my Ko-fi page, or my Redbubble page has stickers of weird stuff like Triceratops and fruit. That's my little self-ad. Now back to sculpting her chest after I did wipe her off with a little bit of water and kind of scrape that area off. Mistakes happen, it's not the worst disaster that I've had. I did smooth down her chest area quite a lot after adding these 2 blobs of clay on, and tried to sculpt out her like collarbone and everything. I think I did make her neck a little bit long. I sort of extended it a couple times while I was working on it, and compared to the size of her head, her human head, it ends up a little bit long, although with her pumpkin head, it looks a little bit more balanced maybe, because her pumpkin head ends up being quite large, as you'll see in a minute. I really cannot emphasize how much of this was just sculpting, carving away, sculpting again, putting her in the toaster oven at 200 degrees Fahrenheit for 20 minutes, and then taking her out after she had dried off a little, which you apparently can do with air dry clay, is a thing that I learned. I extended her torso a little bit after testing her and deciding she looked a little bit short in the torso. I had worked on her legs, but I think this was when I moved onto her hands. And her hands are basically just a series of tubes, as you might imagine. And here comes one of the weirder parts. So when deciding how to make her hands and feet, I had to figure out, so I had taken the wires, I had embedded them in polymer clay, and I had a little S-hook on them. But I had to figure out how to keep the S-hook inside the ball without touching the sides of the ball. So I decided to do this temporary cardboard and glue situation, and then sculpt the ball around it so that the ball could fit in the joint, and I could make sure that the ball fit in the joint, but that the S-hook wouldn't get like clay in it or anything like that. I used hot glue because hot glue tends to be easy to take apart. And I figured that I could just kind of take apart the hot glue and then pull those little pieces of cardboard out. I will say, this worked perfect for this one hand, although the ball is super wobbly. But then this other hand broke. It's fine, I put it back together, but it's just funny that the 2 that I got on camera, the 1 hand and 1 foot that I got on camera, did not work at all and broke, but the other hand and foot actually worked pretty well with this method, and I managed to just pull the cardboard and glue out, and then they ended up being exactly how I wanted them to be, which is just sort of balls on the outside. I definitely think next time I make a doll like this, I will just go with like wooden beads, but although I don't know how I'm going to cut through wooden beads if I have them, which was really the reason why I didn't use wooden beads for this, was because I was too nervous about cutting through them, sawing, Dremel, I don't know. So I'm working on the hands now. You can see that the armature just wasn't long enough and was also a little bit too thick, to be honest. I probably should have just used like one piece of wire per finger because of how thin the fingers have to be in order for her to look okay. Right now these mostly just look like mittens, but I carve into them later using basically similar methods as the rest of the body, which is just carving out pieces of the hands and then adding a little bit more clay and then carving out a little bit again. For example, her pinky finger ends up too short at first, so I later add clay to kind of thicken that out. And the air dry clay held up a lot better than I worried it had. It would. Even now, like, the air dry clay, besides one thing, Shake's fist, which I'll discuss later, this does turn out pretty well. One of the recommendations I have when working on hands, at least for me, both when drawing hands and when sculpting them, is kind of making the sections between the joints quite flat. So I flatten the tops of her fingers at like between each knuckle, basically, and I think that really helps with the illusion of making them look jointed instead of just like wibbly little bits. I also added the knuckles at like the top portion, and I did a test once this was all like dry and everything, and it actually turned out pretty well. I strung her kind of loosely, but she could hold a pose, and then I took her apart again and I worked on some other things, such as her feet, which I had made a little bit too large, and I didn't realize this until later, but since I have to put a shoe on her, the shoe ends up being a little bit oddly sized looking. I think I might have just made her feet look too large in general, and also sort of wide, but that's fine. She just has wide feet and large feet. Like, don't worry about it. The two parts of the head were, of course, like not fit together super well since they were like two completely separate pieces. And what I decided to do was take some little like scrap plastic that I have and put a little bit of clay on each side of the plastic and then sort of smush the head together in the position I wanted it to be. That way the plastic would create a completely smooth surface, and when I put these two sides of the head together, it would perfectly match up, basically. I had wanted to do a magnet in the head, but I ended up, well, I did do a magnet eventually in her face, but I ended up not putting a magnet in the other portion of the head anyways, so I didn't show it, and don't worry about it because it doesn't get used. But once I put her ears on, her head kind of fits together between her ears. Like, they sort of tuck into each other well enough that I just didn't worry about putting the magnet in or on. So, stringing test number 2. The first stringing test was just with her hands, and the second stringing test is with the entirety of her body. Just to see if I can, really. And also to do some of the more aesthetic sculpting, like her hips and things like that, but to make sure that they don't interfere too much with her legs. I probably undersculpted a little bit, to be honest, because her legs don't fit as tightly. I was just trying to maintain sort of the ability to move them, but I feel like I probably could have made them a little bit less posable, but sort of thickened them up and made them match the body a little bit better. I believe I gave her kneecaps at this point also, just to kind of fill in that gap. I've seen people do it different ways. I tried the kneecaps thing. I didn't really like how the kneecaps end up looking, so I think on my next doll I would just go for making the top part of the legs like meet the bottom part of the legs. The pumpkin head was an adventure, and I tried a few different things, which you'll see a little bit of in this video, but basically what I end up doing is gluing together a ball, which I really should have just gotten a ball from, I guess I could have just gotten like a ball from somewhere and used that instead. But I made this ball out of hot glue and cardboard, and I wrap it in tinfoil, and I essentially paper mache it. I don't know how actual paper mache works that well. I mean, it's glue and water. So what I did was I took some wood glue, because I have a lot of wood glue hanging around. And paper's basically wood anyways, right? And you know what else is paper/wood? Paper clay, which I ended up taking all of these scraps of clay, which I had saved, putting them in water, and then also putting glue in the water. I don't know, didn't really have to put this paper clay in, but I just figured that, like, maybe the dust from the little tiny bits of paper clay might dissolve and, like, I don't know, help bind it together. I have no idea if it did anything. But, you know, there was glue in that water also, and that was nice. So I just took some random newspapers, thank you Grandma for giving me the newspapers, dipped them / soaked them in the glue / water / dried paper clay mixture, and wrapped up the balls. Now I actually used the smaller of these two balls on screen in the end, by waiting until it was dried, then cutting it in half, which is what you see here. So this is the dried little bit. You can see little bits of dried clay on her. And I tried to sculpt the ridges of the pumpkin out of paper mache. It didn't go too well, but I didn't have any clay, or like I had a very little amount of clay and I was worried about running out at the time. So I do end up just going to get clay at the store later so that I can add clay over and make her face a lot smaller. I probably should have just gone with one layer of paper mache, seeing as this head just gets a little bit oversized for her body, although it adds to some sort of cartoony aesthetic in the end. So painting was a whole bit of a disaster. So I did start out with painting her with glue for sealant and then with some gesso. I didn't paint inside most of the bits of her, but I did try and get as far down as I could in like the inner tubes, because I wanted to try and seal them as best as I could without clogging up the holes. So I tried to keep only like one layer of gesso or paint over those areas so she's somewhat sealed. So what I do is I start out with a charcoal color, and the painting just, so many things went wrong. So my idea was that I could blush her in the way that like, in the way that I see people do dolls online, but I think I just don't have the right sealant for that, so once I get to sealing her, it doesn't work out. But also, the chalk ends up being not dark enough, so what I tried to do is darken her. Instead of making her charcoal, I make her completely black, and then use the chalk to give her, like, lighter areas, which, like, looks super nice until I try to put the sealant on, and then it totally messes everything up. I do wish I had some sort of matte sealant to put over this doll, because I think just, like, even the shininess is, like, kind of irritating, because she's, like, a very shadowy figure. Like, that's why she's basically all dark and stuff like that in the original picture, and So I feel like she would look much more shadowy if she was completely matte instead of shiny, which is what happens after I add the matte, quote unquote, matte, sealant, which isn't very matte. I even try to like sponge it on to prevent it from like messing up the chalk, and like I add another layer of chalk after the first round of watered down sealant, but it just like the water messes with the chalk too much. You can get it to stay on if you use like a very light hand maybe, and you like put multiple layers, but it was just frustrating. So the hands look so good, and then they get mattified and they /sealanted, and they just look not as good anymore. So after the disaster with painting the body, I felt pretty bummed out, but it's okay. We move on. We move on to the pumpkin head, which includes this little stem that goes on top of her head. And this was the more fun part of painting because I got to actually put like different colors and reds and oranges and everything. The area around the head holes gets a little bit of carving to make it a little bit smoother throughout, even up until like the very end. And then, of course, gets sealed. And here we have the first test of the whole body together, now that it's been painted and sealed, and also I put little fabric in between the joints, but seemingly lost that footage. And now she has to get clothes. So this is just a pair of tights that I cut up, and I just even used the top and bottom are just the sides of the tights, and then I just had to sew up the sides of the suit. I just sewed it directly onto her body. It might be able to come off, to be honest, because like it's very stretchy fabric, but I'm worried about ripping it, so they can just stay on her. And then she also gets a little bit of decoration. These are just little leaves. They're to match the leaves that are going to be on the stem of her pumpkin. I'm sorry for the overexposure, by the way, in this video. At certain points, I just exposed it too much because I was worried about the darkness of like the fabrics and the doll messing with the camera's exposure. So throughout, I know there are a few parts that are like over or underexposed, and it's because I had left them from previous sections where I was like showing the doll. I made the skirt just by doing like these dots that are a certain length apart and then sewing through all those dots and tightening it so all of these sections would be even, and then I stiffened it out with some glue, and later on also paint the skirt. The top portion of the skirt is just made out of the tights again, and it's just made into an oval by folding it in several places and then cutting and then putting it around the doll's body. I tested it. It was a little bit too loose, but I just sew it up in the back a little bit later. I cut a bunch of triangles into it, and because the fabric is so stretchy, naturally curled it on themselves. I add some leaves as decoration to the top of the pumpkin, and also some string to represent the vines, like the smaller vines that are used to make the bow, which is in the original drawing, and that's just out of embroidery thread. The shoes are a whole big production. They have to be ballet shoes, so I start with cardboard, and ballet shoes tend to be a little bit flat-ish at the tip, so I used a piece of paper to make that sort of flat tip / flat cone, and I put fabric over the top of it and just glue that fabric down. I used a lot of tiny clips and then glued everything down, and then tiny clips again and glued everything down. Maybe someone could probably sew these together on such a tiny scale, but gluing them was just the way that I decided to go. I was kind of tired of sewing at this point. I just used a second piece of fabric for the back part and folded that down, let that dry again. The shoes did end up a little bit sort of wrinkly in places I didn't want them to be, but honestly, I think if I tried like a second pass on these shoes, I could make them like perfect, like exactly how I would want them to be. But the first pass is okay. I didn't have any ribbons, so I cut up some bias tape into some ribbons, painted it, and that'll be the ribbons on her shoes, which I'm painting in the colors of candy corn to match the shoes. I also wrapped them around some pens so they would naturally be kind of like curled, hold their shape just a little bit as they would be wrapped around her legs later. They just get glued onto her shoes. Here's painting the skirt, which I for some reason did on this napkin. I should have just used, later I used a piece of plastic to paint things on because it didn't hold on to all of the water as well as the napkin did. But basically I just painted orange to match the color a little bit. I decided not to go opaque and just let it be sort of see-through and let the original pattern shine through. Sewing the little leaves on. There was a lot of drawing time between all the painting, so this really is like as it was in real life, just jumping from thing to thing. And then finally, painting the shoes. Yellow, orange, and white. Colors of the candy corn, obviously. I'm not a fan of candy corn. You know, sound off in the comments if you also despise candy corn, but find it visually intriguing. And just leave if you like candy corn. I'm just kidding. Stay, like, and subscribe. If you like candy corn, like and subscribe. And if you don't like candy corn, also like and subscribe. Just everyone like and subscribe. The ribbons did turn out a little bit too dark on top, so I added a little bit of paint. And lastly, of course, shiny paint, metallics, which I painted on the shoes and a little bit on the ribbons. I used them pretty opaque on the shoes and sort of used a watered down version to make the ribbons a little bit shiny. And then we're done. I took her out to the woods for this photo shoot, and I love her. She's so darling. There are parts of her design that I think were a little bit clunky, but she matches pretty well with the original concept, other than not having a cat with her. I like that you can take on and off her head to make her this, like, more ghostly spirit, and then she can put her head on, so she's a proper pumpkin ballerina. Her head did crack. The pumpkin head did crack a little bit. There's a little crack, which is a little annoying because her head was quite tight, so shoving her on cracked it once, so just ignore that little detail. She's strung a little loosely, but she can hold a pose decently well, especially with her hands, and I used a string, of course, to support her. You can see the string in the background, that's no secret. So I hope you like my first ball jointed doll. She is not perfect, but she's so impressive to me. Here's her next to all of my other dolls, and you can see the first ball jointed doll I did was that little piggy that I did just as like a tiny test. It can move its legs, arms, and head. And of course my wire dolls. When I took her out, I put her in my backpack and we took this little photo shoot in the woods, hanging out in the sunshine. So I hope you liked this video, and have a happy Halloween.